Once again, let's take a trip back to 1969. And now it's time to explore some of the records that hit the shelves in July of that year. So without further ado, let's begin.
Touch me, babe. Can't you see that I am not afraid?
The Soft Parade was the Doors' fourth studio album and one of the most controversial records of their career. Rather than continuing with their usual sound, the band decided to take a different direction, bringing in brass and string arrangements to give the music a fuller and more orchestral feel. But inevitably, this change ended up dividing both critics and fans. The album received mostly negative reviews, with critics criticizing its use of brass and string arrangements and describing the record as both pretentious and syrupy. And publications such as Rolling Stone also dismissed much of the material, describing the songs as pale shadows of the band's earlier works.
Tell all the people that you see, it's just me. There will never be another one who can do the things you do, oh, wild child, full of grace. Well, I've got the running blues running away back to LA.
But despite the negative reviews, the Soft Parade produced one of the band's biggest hits with Touch Me, while tracks like Shaman's Blues, Wild Child, and the ambitious title suite have earned greater appreciation over the years. The record remains the Doors' most polarizing album, but it showed a band willing to experiment at a time when rock music itself was rapidly evolving. And even though many fans will probably not share my opinion, this is one of my favorite albums by the Doors. The Soft Parade peaked at number 6 on the Billboard 200, but fared poorly in the UK, where the album failed to reach the charts. Five Leaves Left was the debut album by English singer-songwriter Nick Drake. The album was recorded over the course of nearly a year and produced by Joe Boyd, and the sessions featured contributions from several leading figures on the British folk scene such as Richard Thompson from Fairport Convention and Danny Thompson of Pentangle. But despite the additional musicians, the focus remained firmly on Drake's voice and his intricate guitar playing, which created an intimate atmosphere that became one of the album's defining qualities.
When the day is done, down to earth and sinks the sun. Fame is but a fruit tree, so very unsound, it can never flourish. Saturday sun came without warning.
At the time, the album went pretty much unnoticed. Nick Drake's reluctance to perform live meant that he rarely toured or promoted his music, which also affected the album's sales. But reviews in the British press were also far from enthusiastic, as evidenced by this review from the New Musical Express. Music critic Gordon Coxhill wrote,
"I'm sorry I can't be more enthusiastic because he obviously has a not inconsiderable amount of talent, but there is not nearly enough variety on this debut LP to make it entertaining. His voice reminds me very much of Peter Sarstedt, but his songs lack Sarstedt's penetration and arresting quality. Exceptions are Mary Jane, a fragile little love song, and Saturday Sun, a reflective number, on which the singer also plays a very attractive piano."
Nick Drake had sold relatively few albums by the time of his death in 1974, but his work began to attract both critical and commercial attention by the end of the 80s. His recorded output was gradually reassessed, and Drake achieved cult status. And nowadays, more than 50 years after his death, Five Leaves Left is widely regarded as one of the best debut LPs of its era and one of the greatest British folk albums ever recorded, appearing on numerous lists of the greatest records of all time. Another record from July 1969 that is now widely regarded as a classic of British folk rock is the third album by Fairport Convention. Just like their previous LP, the album saw the group embracing traditional British folk music with far greater confidence, and the record included two of Fairport Convention's best-known performances. Who Knows Where the Time Goes, which was written by lead singer Sandy Denny, became one of the group's signature songs and one of the most beloved among fans of the band. Unfortunately, I can't play excerpts from the song due to copyright restrictions, but if you're familiar with it, you already know how great it is. And another well-known highlight from the album is the band's interpretation of the traditional ballad A Sailor's Life, which is often credited as one of the earliest examples of British folk rock in its fully developed form.
yon green island as we passed it by.
The album gave the band their first chart success in Britain, spending a total of 8 weeks in the UK album chart and reaching number 12. And its reputation continued to grow in the decades that followed. Nowadays, the album is regarded as one of Fairport Convention's finest LPs and one of the most influential British folk rock records ever made, helping to establish a distinctly British identity for a genre that had previously been dominated by American influences. Stand Up was Jethro Tull's second studio album and the record that established the band as one of the leading names in British rock. Following the departure of original guitarist Mick Abrahams over musical differences, Ian Anderson took full creative control, and he steered the band away from the blues-based sound of their debut album and towards a more adventurous approach, resulting in a far more varied and ambitious album than its predecessor. And the record also introduced guitarist Martin Barre, whose playing would become an essential part of the group's sound for decades to come.
Don't want to be a fat man. Have not the patience to ignore all that. Spent a long time looking for hurricanes to play. So when you look into the sun, see all the things we haven't done. Each to his own way, I'll go mine. Best of luck with what you find.
Stand Up became Jethro Tull's commercial breakthrough, reaching number 1 on the UK albums chart and receiving enthusiastic reviews from critics. And it's also famous for its distinctive pop-up sleeve, designed by James Grasho, one of the most memorable pieces of album packaging of the era. This is one of the key records in Jethro Tull's catalogue, marking the point where the band developed the unique musical identity that would define much of their later career. Along with Aqualung, this is my favourite record by Jethro Tull. July 1969 saw the release of the debut record by Yes. The Yes album, which was released a couple of years later in 1971, is usually regarded as the record where the band truly hit their stride, and that's certainly one of their greatest albums. However, the group's first 2 records are often considered minor entries in their discography, but I think their debut album is a much stronger record than it's usually given credit for. At the time, the group still featured guitarist Peter Banks, who would later be replaced by Steve Howe. And even though the album already hinted at the musical direction they would explore throughout the following decade, it was less overtly progressive and more influenced by late 60s psychedelia.
Einen Titel aus ihrer Langspielplatte, Looking Around.
Yes!
Alongside original compositions, the record also featured inventive reinterpretations of songs like Every Little Thing by the Beatles and I See You by the Byrds, reflecting the sort of bands that inspired their music.
When I'm walking beside her, people tell me I'm lucky. Yes, I know I'm a lucky guy.
The album received generally positive reviews, including praise from Lester Bangs, who ironically later became one of progressive rock's biggest detractors in the press. However, despite the favourable reviews, the record failed to chart. But still, as I already mentioned, I think it's a much stronger record than it's usually given credit for. And even though it doesn't reach the heights of some of their later albums, such as Fragile or Close to the Edge, it's an impressive first statement from a group that was already determined to forge its own musical identity.
Take this bomb, drop it on old Hong Kong. Whoa, no, you ain't gonna give me things like that.
July 1969 also saw the release of the second and final album by Blossom Toes. The group's first album, which was released in 1967, is one of the greatest and most overlooked British psychedelic records of the era. It's a truly brilliant album that deserves to be remembered alongside all the great psychedelic records from that period. But by 1969, music had changed, and even though this second album still retained elements of psychedelia, Blossom Toes adopted a heavier style with darker lyrical themes that contrasted with the more whimsical psychedelic approach of their first album.
Where did you go wrong? 100% gold plated, purified love bomb.
But one of the absolute highlights of the album is the song Peace Loving Man, which is truly one of the heaviest songs of 1969.
Oh, no, no! You ain't gonna get me!
The track combined heavy riffs with a wild and totally unhinged vocal delivery that seemed to anticipate the vocal styles of some of the more extreme forms of metal that would emerge a couple of decades later.
Oh, no, no! You ain't gonna get me!
The album found a dedicated underground following, but it received mostly mixed reviews in the press, who at the time often dismissed heavier music as monotonous and lacking in interest. Blossom Toes ended up splitting up the following year, but in the decades since, the album has steadily grown in reputation, and tracks like the aforementioned Peace Loving Man still stun listeners more than 50 years after their original release.
So let me sing a song for you, just to help your day along.
Happy Sad was Tim Buckley's third studio album and a record that marked a major turning point in his career. The album saw Buckley moving away from the psychedelic folk sound of his earlier releases and embracing a more adventurous blend of folk and jazz. Unlike the concise songwriting of his previous albums, Happy Sad featured longer compositions built around minimalist arrangements, with David Friedman's vibraphone giving the record a distinctive atmosphere.
Just like a buzzing fly, come into your life. I'll float away like honey in the sun. You're gonna lose that strange feeling. Oh, just like a soldier boy, I've been out fighting wars.
The album became his highest charting release, reaching number 81 on the Billboard chart. But Buckley's increasingly experimental approach would eventually alienate some of his fan base, and he started losing the mainstream appeal he had gained with his previous two records. Nevertheless, Happy Sad is now widely regarded as one of the defining singer-songwriter albums of the late 60s, and the record that laid the foundation for the even more adventurous music he would make over the following years.
I hear the siren calling, the rain comes gently falling.
Wassa Wassa was the debut album by the Edgar Broughton Band and one of the earliest releases on EMI's newly established Harvest label. The group was originally formed as a blues band, but they gradually embraced the psychedelic underground, and this debut captured that transition with a raw and uncompromising sound that blended blues, psychedelia, and hard rock. The sound of the record relies on aggressive fuzz guitars and Edgar Broughton's gravelly vocals, which drew frequent comparisons to Captain Beefheart.
Thought I heard a raindrop fall, a trickle dum-dee-dee. To find the better life, the salsa in the sky. Evil, evil, all black as night.
The album also reflected the band's outspoken political views, with songs addressing subjects such as the Vietnam War and the dehumanizing effects of modern society.
They're sending him home, shot through to the bone. He had a red cross on his arm. All I got was napalm.
Even though the Edgar Broughton Band never achieved mainstream success, they enjoyed a loyal following on the British underground scene, attracting hippies, countercultural audiences, and other musical outsiders. And their debut album remains one of the most distinctive and uncompromising British rock debuts of 1969.
Dreams of milk and honey are running through my head.
Mountain was the debut solo album by Leslie West. The record was produced by Felix Pappalardi, and it laid the foundations for the band Mountain, which West and Pappalardi would form shortly afterwards, taking its name directly from the record. The sound of the album was built around Leslie West's huge guitar tone and powerful vocals, producing a sound that was heavier than much of what was being recorded in America at the time.
Crying in the orchard with the sunshine at my side. Oh, red, tears and shades of gray. I have changed you, I have lost forever from today.
Songs like Blood of the Sun, Long Red, and Dreams of Milk and Honey would later become staples of Mountain's live performances, helping to establish the band's identity before they had even released an official studio album. Even though the album only managed to reach number 72 on the Billboard chart, it proved to be a crucial stepping stone in Leslie West's career. Within weeks of its release, the newly formed Mountain appeared at the Woodstock Festival, and the heavier sound first explored on this album would soon make the band one of the pioneers of hard rock and an important influence on the early development of heavy metal.
And now here's the brand new single from one of America's most exciting rock bands. It's The Doors with Touch Me. Turn it up!
Come on, come on, come on, come on, now touch me, babe. Can't you see that I am not afraid?
I hope you enjoyed this trip back to July 1969. See you next time.